Staff Sergeant Miller held the battered Zippo lighter up to the light, squinting at the engraving. "What kind of name is Rooster?" He laughed, the sound echoing off the tile walls. "Did you wake the farmhouse up to milk the cows, old man?" The question hung in the air, and suddenly, the clatter of 200 forks hitting plates ceased. The mess hall went dead silent. The laughter died in Miller's throat as he noticed the sudden, heavy tension in the room. Harlan Vance didn't look up from his tray of cold peas. He just reached out a trembling, grease-stained hand. "It wasn't a name I chose, son," he whispered, the sound cutting through the silence like a knife. It was the sound the enemy heard right before the sky fell down. Where are you watching this story from? Let us know in the comments. If this journey of valor touched you, consider subscribing to Silent Veterans and help us give a voice to more incredible stories of our silent veterans. The air inside the Camp Lejeune mess hall was a chaotic symphony of lunch rush. Trays slammed against metal rails, industrial dishwashers hummed, and 300 Marines in dress blues shouted over the noise. It was Commandant's Day, a sea of midnight blue and gold buttons, a pristine display of youth and energy. Sitting alone in the shadow of a vending machine, ignored by the cacophony, was Harlan Vance. He was a glitch in the matrix. Amidst the perfectly pressed uniforms, Harlan wore a faded, fraying red and black plaid flannel shirt that looked like it had been bought at a hardware store in 1995. His gray hair was a mess of tangled wire, and his hands, knotted with arthritis and permanently stained with engine grease from his job as the base janitor, trembled slightly as he pushed a pile of cold peas around his metal tray. "Is this some kind of joke?" The voice was loud, but it barely made a dent in the surrounding noise of the hall. Harlan stopped chewing. He felt the vibration of heavy boots stomping toward him. Staff Sergeant Miller halted directly in front of the table. Miller was 28, physically flawless mirror, and possessed the arrogance of a man who had never been shot at. He had noticed the civilian in the red flannel shirt sitting among his Marines, and it offended his sense of order. "I asked you a question, old man," Miller barked, slamming his hand onto the metal table. The tray jumped. A splash of milk landed on Harlan's sleeve. "Who authorized you to eat here during a Protocol Level 1 event?" Nearby, a few privates glanced over, but the room kept moving. The chatter continued. It was just an NCO dressing down a civilian worker. Nothing new. Harlan slowly wiped the milk from his red sleeve. He didn't stand. "It's lunchtime, Sergeant," Harlan said softly, his voice raspy. "Contract says janitors eat at 11:30. I'm just eating my peas." Miller's face flushed crimson. "Contract," he sneered, leaning in, blocking the light. "You're a soup sandwich. You're a stain on this hall. We have the Commandant arriving in 1 hour, and I have a hobo in a flannel shirt sitting here like he owns the place." Miller's eyes darted to the table. Lying next to the tray was an object that didn't belong. A Zippo lighter, battered, brass worn down to the base metal, dented as if it had stopped a shrapnel fragment. Miller snatched it up. "Give that back," Harlan said, his voice dropping. Miller ignored him, turning the lighter over. He squinted at the faint, scratched engraving on the side. He read it loud enough to be heard over the din of the chow hall. "Rooster." The effect was instantaneous. It started at the table nearest to them, a group of senior warrant officers. They stopped eating. Then the silence spread like a shockwave, rippling outward. The clinking of silverware stopped. The conversation died. Within 3 seconds, the massive mess hall went completely, unnervingly silent. Miller looked around, confused. He had expected laughter. Instead, he felt the heavy weight of 300 pairs of eyes fixed on him. Or rather, fixed on the name he had just shouted. "That's your call sign," Miller scoffed, trying to regain control of the room, his voice sounding too loud in the sudden quiet. "Rooster? What? Did you dodge the draft hiding in a chicken coop?" Nobody laughed. The silence was thick, suffocating. It was the kind of silence usually reserved for a funeral. "I'm going to have you removed," Miller hissed, unnerved by the lack of reaction from his squad. "I'm going to have security toss you and your little farm animal lighter out the gate." Harlan slowly reached out, his hand, shaking with a tremor that had plagued him since 1969, closed around the lighter. He pulled it gently from Miller's grip. "You're right, Sergeant," Harlan whispered. In the dead silence, his gravelly voice carried to the back of the room. He ran his thumb over the flint wheel. "I do clean toilets, and I don't wear the blues anymore." He looked up. The old man's watery blue eyes were no longer dull. They were burning. "But you asked about the name," Harlan said. He flicked the Zippo. Clink. The flame didn't just light. It roared. A tall, jagged tongue of orange fire erupted, smelling of liquid fuel and sulfur. The moment his thumb brushed the striker, the silence of the mess hall shattered in Harlan's mind. The fluorescent lights flickered and died. The smell of bleach vanished, replaced instantly by the thick, copper scent of blood and the rot of wet jungle vegetation. The white walls dissolved into the green hell of the Aishau Valley. Harlan wasn't in North Carolina anymore. The rooster was back in the cage, and he was about to crow. The smell hit him first. It wasn't the smell of cafeteria green beans or floor wax anymore. It was the heavy, rotting stench of wet vegetation, human waste, and the metallic tang of fear. The air was so thick with moisture you could practically drink it, and the rain didn't fall. It hammered. It was a relentless, vertical ocean that turned the ground into a soup of red clay and decaying leaves. Harlan Vance blinked, and the mess hall was gone. He was 24 years old again. His knuckles weren't swollen with arthritis. They were white-knuckled around the pistol grip of an M16A1. The red flannel shirt was gone, replaced by jungle fatigues that had rotted off his frame 3 days ago, leaving him exposed to the leeches and the mosquitoes that swarmed like black clouds. "Gunny, they're inside the wire. Jesus Christ, they're inside the wire." The voice was high-pitched, cracking with terror. Harlan looked down. Crouched in the mud beside him, buried up to his chest in the sludge of a bomb crater, was Private Sterling. The kid was 19, straight out of a cornfield in Nebraska, and right now, he was trying to shove his intestines back into his stomach with one hand while clutching the handset of the PRC-25 radio with the other. "Keep pressure on it, Sterling," Harlan barked, his voice struggling to be heard over the deafening roar of AK-47 fire shredding the canopy above them. "Why don't you look at it? Look at me." They were deep in the Aishau Valley, the Valley of Death. Intel had said it was a light supply route. Intel had been wrong. They had dropped a 6-man recon team right on top of an NVA regiment. 6 men against 1,000. For 3 days, they had been running. For 3 days, the invisible enemy had herded them like cattle, pushing them higher and higher up the slopes of Hill 937, tightening the noose. Now there was nowhere left to run. A mortar round impacted 20 yards to their left. The ground heaved. Mud, hot shrapnel, and pieces of bamboo rained down on them. Harlan shook the dirt from his eyes and checked his magazine. Empty. He slammed a fresh one in, his last one. "Gunny, Air Command says they can't see us." Sterling screamed, pressing the radio handset to his ear, tears streaming down his mud-caked face. "The ceiling is too low. The rain is masking the IR. They can't drop unless they have a visual." Harlan looked up. The sky was a solid sheet of gray slate. The monsoon was shielding the enemy. Above the clouds, Harlan could hear the faint, angry whine of F-4 Phantoms circling loaded with snake and nape, heavy drag bombs and napalm. They were the gods of war, waiting to unleash hell, but they were blind. "Tell them to drop on the coordinates," Harlan yelled, firing a 3-round burst into the green wall of jungle ahead of them. Shadows moved in the mist. The enemy was close, close enough to smell the garlic on their breath. "They won't do it," Sterling sobbed. "Danger close is in effect. If they drop blind, they'll kill us all." Harlan looked at his team. Jenkins was dead, draped over a log 10 feet away. Miller, no relation to the staff sergeant back home, just another ghost, was bleeding out from a chest wound, his eyes glassy. It was just him and the kid, and the enemy was closing the circle. The pop-pop-pop of the AKs was getting rhythmic, confident. They knew the Americans were out of ammo. They knew the air support was useless. They were coming in for the kill. Harlan looked at Sterling. The kid was fading. The blood loss was making him pale beneath the grime. If the NVA broke through the tree line, They wouldn't just kill Sterling, they would drag him off to a camp in the north. Harlan had seen what they did to prisoners. "Give me the handset," Harlan said. His voice was calm. It was the terrifying calm of a man who has accepted that he is already dead. "Gunny." I said, "Give me the damn radio, Sterling." Harlan snatched the heavy black handset. He looked around. To their right, a jagged spine of rock jutted out from the jungle floor, climbing upward like a broken tooth. It was completely exposed. No cover, no trees, just bare rock rising into the gray mist. If he stayed in the crater, they died. If he climbed that rock, he would be the only target in the valley. Harlan Vance didn't hesitate. "Stay down, kid," Harlan growled. "Put your face in the mud and don't look up until the heat stops." "Where are you going?" Sterling cried out, reaching for him. "I'm going to wake the neighbors." Harlan stood up. The movement drew fire instantly. Green tracers zipped past his head like angry hornets. He ignored them. He scrambled out of the muddy crater, his boots slipping on the slick clay, and sprinted toward the rock formation. The mud tried to suck him down. The jungle vines grabbed at his ankles. Bullets chewed up the ground around his feet, spraying geysers of dirt. He slammed his body against the base of the rock and started to climb. It was suicide. He was climbing out of the safety of the jungle canopy and into the open air. He was making himself a silhouette against the gray sky. 10 feet up, a bullet grazed his thigh. He grunted but kept climbing. 20 feet up, the wind hit him, cold and fierce. 30 feet up, he reached the summit, a narrow ledge of granite overlooking the entire valley floor. From up here, he could see them, hundreds of straw hats and pith helmets moving through the elephant grass below, a sea of enemies swarming toward the crater where Sterling lay dying. Harlan thumbed the transmit button on the handset. The static hissed in his ear. "Checkmate King 2, checkmate King 2, this is Recon Team Dagger." Harlan screamed into the mic. "Dagger, this is King 2. The pilot's voice crackled back, sounding bored and distant. "We are still blind. Cannot acquire target. Aborting run." "Negative, negative on abort," Harlan roared. He stood up fully on the ledge. He was a statue on a pedestal, visible to every enemy soldier in the valley. The NVA saw him. The firing stopped for a split second, as if they were confused by the insanity of the American standing in the open. Then, every gun in the valley turned toward the rock. The air around Harlan snapped and hissed. Bullets chipped the stone by his boots. One punched through his shoulder, spinning him around. He slammed back against the rock, gasping, blood pouring down his arm. He keyed the mic again. "I am popping smoke. I am popping smoke on my position." Harlan ripped a smoke grenade from his webbing, pulled the pin with his teeth, and held it over his head. Thick, violet smoke poured out, billowing into the wind, creating a massive purple arrow pointing right at him. "I see the smoke, Dagger," the pilot said, his voice tightening. "But that's right on top of you. That's danger close. Repeat, confirm danger close." Harlan watched the enemy soldiers surging up the hill toward him. They were screaming now, a war cry that chilled the blood. "Confirm danger close," Harlan yelled. "Drop it. Drop it all. I need a visual marker to adjust the angle, Dagger. The wind is taking the smoke. I can't see you." Harlan looked down at the crater. He couldn't see Sterling, but he knew the kid was there. Waiting. Dying. Harlan Vance closed his eyes for a second. He thought of his mother's front porch in Alabama. He thought of the girl he left behind in Mobile. Then he opened his eyes, took a deep breath of the rain-soaked air, and did the only thing he could think of to cut through the noise of the wind and the war. He screamed. He didn't scream for help. He didn't scream in pain. He threw his head back and let out a sound that defied the jungle. It was a primal, guttural roar into the radio handset, a broken, jagged sound that rose and fell, piercing the static. "Crow, you bastards! Crow!" He screamed at the jets above the clouds. "I am the rooster. I am the mark. Drop on my voice." High above, inside the cockpit of the lead Phantom, the pilot heard it. A sound so distinct, so insane, cutting through the electronic fuzz. It sounded like a rooster crowing the sun up in the middle of hell. "Visual on the madman on the ridge," the pilot said, dipping his wing. "I see him. He's standing tall, rolling in hot." Harlan saw the clouds break. 2 silver darts punched through the gray ceiling. The sound of the jet engines was a physical blow, a sonic boom that shattered the air. As the phantoms dived, the NVA soldiers froze. Looking up, Harlan dropped the radio. He looked down at the crater one last time. "Sleep tight, Sterling," he whispered. The world turned white. The napalm canisters tumbled from the wings, end over end, silver eggs of destruction. They hit the jungle floor 50 yards in front of Harlan's rock. It wasn't an explosion. It was an erasure. A wall of liquid fire, orange and black, rose up like a tsunami. It swallowed the trees. It swallowed the enemy. It swallowed the sound of the guns. The heat was instantaneous, searing Harlan's eyebrows, blistering the skin on his face. The pressure wave hit him like a freight train, lifting him off his feet and throwing him backward off the ledge. He fell through the air, the roar of the fire consuming everything. He hit the mud hard, rolling, tumbling, debris raining down on him. The oxygen was sucked out of the valley, replaced by the suffocating fumes of burning jelly. He crawled, blind, deaf, bleeding. He crawled back toward the crater. The heat was unbearable. The jungle was a blast furnace. He felt a hand. He wiped the mud from his eyes. Sterling was there, terrified, untouched by the fire that had stopped just yards from their hole. The napalm had burned a perfect circle around them, incinerating the enemy regiment but leaving the crater intact. Harlan grabbed Sterling's hand. The kid was shaking, staring at the wall of fire that reached the sky. "Gunny," Sterling rasped. You brought the sun down." Harlan tried to speak, but his throat was scorched. He coughed, spitting up black soot. He looked at his hand. He was still holding his Zippo lighter, gripping it so hard the metal was cutting into his palm. He hadn't realized he'd pulled it out. The fire crackled, sounding like a million dry leaves breaking at once. "The rooster," Sterling whispered, looking at Harlan with a mixture of horror and worship. "I heard you on the radio. You crowed." Harlan leaned back against the mud, the adrenaline crashing, the pain in his shoulder finally registering. He watched the phantom jets bank upward, their afterburners glowing against the dark clouds. He was alive. God knows how, but he was alive. But as he closed his eyes, listening to the crackle of the burning jungle, he knew something else. Harlan Vance had died on that ridge. The man breathing in the mud now. He was something else. He was the survivor. He was the keeper of the flame. He was the rooster. The memory began to fade. The smell of burning flesh and napalm started to recede, replaced slowly, agonizingly, by the smell of industrial bleach. The roar of the jets softened into the hum of a ventilation system. Harlan blinked. The green jungle dissolved. The white tiles of the mess hall returned. He was sitting in the chair. His hand was clenched tight, but he wasn't holding a radio handset anymore. He was holding the Zippo, and the flame was still burning, a tiny, unwavering light in the silent mess hall. Harlan snapped the Zippo shut. Click. The flame vanished, and with it, the ghosts of the Aishao Valley. The silence in the mess hall, however, remained. It hung heavy in the air, a thick blanket that smothered the usual lunchtime chatter. Staff Sergeant Miller was the first to break it. He shook his head, as if waking from a trance, and the confusion on his face quickly curdled back into rage. He felt foolish. He had let an old janitor with a magic trick silence his entire command. "That's it," Miller snapped, his voice tight. "You think you can intimidate me with a lighter? You think some old war story gives you the right to sit at the commandant's table?" Harlan didn't answer. He carefully placed the Zippo back in his pocket, patting the flannel shirt to make sure it was secure. He picked up his fork again. "I'm talking to you, Vance," Miller shouted, grabbing the back of Harlan's chair. "Get up. Now, you're done here. I'm escorting you to the gate myself." "Stand by." The roar came from the main doors at the far end of the mess hall. It was a voice projected with the force of a cannon shot, instantly overriding Miller's shouting. "Attention on deck. The reaction was Pavlovian. 300 chairs scraped against the linoleum simultaneously. 300 Marines shot to their feet, spines snapping straight, chins tucked, eyes locked forward. The sound of 300 boot heels slamming together echoed like a gunshot. Miller froze. He released Harlan's chair as if it were red hot and spun around, snapping to the position of attention. His face went pale. The double doors swung open. 2 MPs in pristine white helmets stepped aside. General Thomas Hawke. Sterling walked in. He was a mountain of a man, even at 70 years old. He wore the service alphas, the olive green uniform draped with the authority of the highest-ranking officer in the United States Marine Corps. 4 silver stars gleamed on each collar. His chest was a colorful brick wall of ribbons, medals, and badges that told the history of American conflict from Vietnam to the Middle East. But it was his eyes that commanded the room. They were steel gray, sharp, and currently scanning the hall with the intensity of a radar sweep. He didn't walk, he prowled. He moved down the center aisle, followed by a frantic entourage of colonels and sergeant majors who were trying to keep up with his long strides. Miller, standing rigid near the vending machines, swallowed hard. This was his moment. He was the NCO in charge of the sector. He needed to show the commandant that he ran a tight ship. General Sterling marched straight toward them. He wasn't looking at the buffet line, he was looking at the corner table. Miller puffed out his chest. "Good afternoon, General." Miller barked, his voice cracking slightly. "Staff Sergeant Miller, 3rd Battalion. Sir, I apologize for the disturbance. I was just removing a civilian contractor who was violating protocol by occupying the..." The general didn't even blink. He didn't slow down. He walked right past Staff Sergeant Miller as if the young man were a potted plant. Miller blinked, his mouth left hanging open mid-sentence. General Sterling stopped 3 feet from the table. The entourage behind him halted in a chaotic pile-up, confused by the sudden stop. Harlan Vance hadn't stood up. He was still sitting, looking at his peas. The room held its breath. A janitor sitting while the commandant of the Marine Corps stood. It was unheard of. It was heresy. "Harlan," the general said. The voice wasn't the booming command voice from before. It was soft, trembling. Harlan slowly looked up. He squinted at the 4 stars, then up to the general's face. He studied the deep lines, the gray hair, the scar running down the general's jaw, but beneath the age and the rank, Harlan saw the terrified 19-year-old kid in the mud. "Hello, Tommy," Harlan rasped. A collective gasp went through the room. Tommy. The janitor just called the commandant. Tommy. Miller looked like he was about to have a stroke. He stepped forward, unable to help himself. "General, this man is..." "Silence," Sterling said. He didn't shout it. He simply dropped the word like an anvil. He didn't look at Miller. His eyes were locked on Harlan. The general took a step closer. He looked at the faded red flannel shirt. He looked at the grease-stained hands. Then, his eyes drifted to the pocket where the Zippo rested. "I looked for you," General Sterling said, his voice thick with emotion. "After the evac, I spent 10 years looking for you. The record said you were KIA on Hill 937. They said they found dog tags, but no body. I left the tags," Harlan said simply, shrugging. "Didn't feel like being a Marine anymore. Not after the fire. Just wanted to be quiet." "Quiet," Sterling repeated, a sad smile touching his lips. "You were never quiet, Gunny. Not when it mattered." The general slowly raised his right hand. The room watched in disbelief. The commandant of the Marine Corps, the highest authority in the service, was slowly bringing his hand up to the brim of his cover. He snapped a salute. It wasn't a quick, perfunctory check-in. It was a slow, rigid, crisp salute held with absolute reverence. A salute usually reserved for the president or a fallen brother. Harlan sat there for a moment. Then, with a groan of effort, he pushed his chair back. He stood up. He didn't stand like a janitor. He stood with the straight back of a force recon gunnery sergeant. Harlan didn't salute back. Civilians don't salute. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out the Zippo, and held it up. "I heard the rooster crowing," General Sterling whispered, tears finally spilling over his weathered cheeks. I was in the mud, waiting to die. And then I heard you. You called down the thunder. Just doing the job, Tommy, Harlan said. You saved my life, Sterling said, his voice breaking. You saved us all. The general dropped his salute and extended his hand. Harlan took it. The handshake wasn't formal. It was a grip of iron, two old warriors anchoring each other in a world that had moved on without them. Staff Sergeant Miller, the general said, finally turning his head. Miller jumped, sweating profusely. Yes, General. You asked this man what kind of name Rooster is, Sterling said. His voice was cold now. Dangerous. Let me educate you. Rooster is the call sign of Gunnery Sergeant Harlan Vance, Navy Cross recipient, 3 Purple Hearts, the man who voluntarily exposed himself to an entire NVA regiment to save my squad in 1969. Miller looked at Harlan. The old janitor in the flannel shirt suddenly looked 10 feet tall. He is not a soup sandwich, the general continued, his eyes boring into Miller. He is the reason you have a corps to serve in today, do you understand me? Yes, General, Miller squeaked, wishing the floor would open up and swallow him whole. Good, Sterling said. He turned back to Harlan. Come on, Gunny. I think the chow hall is a little loud for us. I've got a car outside, and I believe I owe you a drink. Harlan looked at his tray of cold peas. Then he looked at the general. I get off shift at 1300, Harlan said. The general laughed, a booming sound that broke the tension. Not anymore, you don't. You're officially retired, Rooster. Effective. Immediately. Chapter 4. Legacy and Closing. The walk to the exit was the longest mile Staff Sergeant Miller had ever witnessed. General Sterling didn't rush. He kept his pace slow, matching the limping gait of the old man in the red flannel shirt. They moved through the center aisle of the mess hall like two kings from different eras, one draped in the gold and ribbons of authorized power, the other clad in the invisible armor of forgotten sacrifice. "Oh, make a hole," a corporal whispered near the front. The sea of dress blues parted. It wasn't a forced maneuver this time. There was no barking of orders. The Marine stepped back with a sudden, hushed reverence. They looked at Harlan Vance differently now. 5 minutes ago, he was a stain on their pristine lunchtime. Now, he was a living monument. They looked at his gnarled hands and saw the hands that had pulled their commandant out of the fire. They looked at his gray hair and saw the ash of the Aisha Valley. Miller remained frozen near the vending machines. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He felt naked. Every ribbon on his chest suddenly felt heavy, unearned. He had spent his career polishing his boots and memorizing regulations, believing that perfection was found in the crease of a trouser leg. He had just been shown that perfection was found in the mud, holding a line that should have broken. As the general and the janitor reached the double doors, Sterling paused. He turned back to the room. The general didn't look at Miller. He looked at the 300 young faces staring back at him, the future of the Corps. "Gentlemen," General Sterling said. His voice was calm, but it carried to the back corners of the room without a microphone. "You are trained to fight. You are trained to win. But never forget that the uniform you wear is a receipt." He placed a hand on Harlan's flannel-clad shoulder. "It is a receipt for the debt paid by men like Harlan Vance," Sterling continued. "You walk tall because he crawled. You eat in peace because he starved in the rain. Do not mistake silence for weakness. The loudest thing in this room wasn't your sergeant's shouting. It was this man's memory." Sterling turned to the door. "Let's go home, Rooster." "After you, General," Harlan mumbled, clutching his Zippo. "No," Sterling said, stepping aside and holding the door open. "Rank has its privileges, Gunny, but valor leads the way." Harlan hesitated, then nodded. He stepped out into the blinding North Carolina sunlight, leaving the smell of bleach and the stunned silence of the mess hall behind him forever. The doors swung shut. For a long moment, nobody moved. The hum of the refrigerators seemed deafening. Then, slowly, Staff Sergeant Miller moved. He walked to the table where Harlan had been sitting. The tray of cold peas was still there, the carton of milk, the napkin used to wipe the spill. Miller stared at the empty chair. The plastic seat was cracked. It was the worst seat in the house, tucked behind a loud machine, reserved for the invisible people. Miller reached out and touched the back of the chair. His hand was shaking. "Sergeant?" a young private asked tentatively. Miller didn't answer. He picked up Harlan's tray. He didn't gesture for a subordinate to do it. He didn't bark an order. He picked it up himself, balancing the cold food with a strange fragility. "Clear the area," Miller whispered. "Say again, Sergeant." "I said clear the area." Miller's voice cracked, thick with an emotion the squad had never heard from him before. "Nobody sits at this table. Not today, not tomorrow." Miller walked the tray to the scullery window, his head bowed. He had learned the regulations of the Marine Corps in boot camp, but he had learned the soul of the Marine Corps in the last 10 minutes, and the lesson burned worse than napalm. In the weeks that followed, the protocol at the Camp Lejeune mess hall changed. There was no official order signed by the commandant, no memo circulated by HQ. It just happened. The table in the corner, near the vending machine, was never occupied again. Someone placed a small brass plaque on the wall above it. It didn't have a name. It didn't list dates. It just had a simple engraving of a rooster and 3 words: "He crowed first." Every year, on the anniversary of the Battle of Hill 937, a single Zippo lighter is placed on the table, left open. And every Marine who walks by taps the table twice, once for the general and once for the janitor. Harlan Vance never mopped another floor. He spent his final years on a porch in Virginia, often visited by a 4-star general who would drive down on weekends without his security detail. They would sit in rocking chairs, drinking bourbon as the sun went down, listening to the crickets. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. They knew the truth. The world is full of noise. It is full of people screaming for attention, demanding respect and shouting their names. But the true heroes, the ones who hold the sky up when it threatens to fall, they are the silent ones. They are the ones who walk among us in faded flannel shirts, carrying the fire in their pockets, waiting for the moment when they are needed to crow one last time. If you were moved by Harlan Vance's story of quiet courage, please like this video, share it with someone who respects our veterans, and subscribe to Silent Veterans for more stories of the unassuming heroes who walk among us.